Greetings and welcome back to this video series on countering harmful religion and God images. In our first video, we looked at how fear is the driving force that creates harmful religion. The famous story of Adam and Eve on the first pages of the Bible shows symbolically how people become afraid and, in that process, begin to construct images of God that are against them and are, in fact, violent to them. The story is not about disobedience, as traditional Christianity has moralistically interpreted it. Instead, the story is about losing ground, experiencing deadly fear as a result of the loss of footing, and desperately grasping for straws, that is, for the fruit, which is really for anything inside to create an absolute ground for one's existence. But humans discover that nothing finite can fill the longing for the infinite, craving for hold and security that our spirit seeks. And that is basically the knowledge of good and evil, that nothing finite can satisfy that craving, and that the whole world seems to look evil to us when we don't have that ground under our feet. And that was in contrast to the feeling described symbolically in Genesis 2. Now, today we will look at how this fear of not having footing, of basically feeling like one is in a free fall, how that fear drives the human scourge of war, and how morality in that process gets used by this fear to justify all kinds of inhumanities in the name of the good or of God. We will proceed today in 4 steps, and they will basically follow the outline in chapter 2 of my book, A Violent God Image. And that book introduces basically the analysis that international best-selling author Eugen Drewermann, and here's the spelling of his name in the subtitle here. There it is. That he developed in 2 books, one called War and Christianity, which appeared in many editions and eventually was titled The Spiral of Anxiety. The second, The Deadly Progress, which looks at how Christianity inadvertently did wage war against nature and is still in many respects responsible for the way that the Western mindset deals with nature in a way that fights it. And the third writing that I'll be drawing on a lot is a section in this book. It's called Structures of Evil. And in that section that I'll be referring to, Drewermann looks at how Christianity, by suppressing myth and by becoming one-sidedly rational and anthropocentric, how it fueled wars and also the suppression of women. So that already tells you a little bit about the outline that will follow here. The first will look at reasons for war, from struggle for survival to fears of the human spirit. The second, we will follow Drewermann's argument that ethics always comes too late when it gets to war. Ethics falls short as a solution for war because ethics easily gets used to justify war. We see that currently in 2022 in the war against Ukraine that is happening. Both sides are justifying the war. And with both sides, I don't mean the Ukrainians, actually. I mean the two geopolitical power players that are using this war to further their own purposes. The East, Russia, is justifying it with its own really absurd arguments that it is fighting Nazism. So it's making a moral argument. The Western NATO countries are justifying it to say it is to further democracy and freedom in the world. But both sides are not really being forthcoming and honest here, because a lot of different analysis show that both sides are really motivated by their own self-interest, their own interest in influence. And so ethics, again, is used on both sides, and it cannot be a sufficient tool to fight war, to end actually the problem of war. From Drewermann's perspective, what religion has to offer is to fight war, period. As soon as it gets instrumentalized to say, oh, this is the right war, that is the right war, religion uses all of its credibility. And that's actually the exact opposite of what it's supposed to do. The third thing we will be looking at is then how Christianity actually inadvertently fueled war, and how it fueled the destruction of nature. And it did so through basically two aspects that it emphasized. It is anthropocentric, meaning it put humans in the center of the world, the universe, and it's one-sidedly rational. So this one-sided rationalism makes it suppress the unconscious or the affective layers of our humanity, the evolutionary heritage that we carry with us, and that's connected to nature and that's connected to animals. And then Christianity, by being characterized by this anthropocentrism and the rationalism, used both also to suppress women and to build up a patriarchal hierarchy. So it inadvertently, and often in fairly conscious ways, has supported misogyny. And then in the fourth step, we look at Drewermann's argument that religion actually holds a solution to the problem of war. That it does so, though not through lofty talk, but through certain rituals that can symbolically act out in safe ways. Symbolically, this is the important piece, not in external ways, but symbolically, the aggression that is fueled both by evolutionary dynamics and by the fears of the human spirit, and address also guilt feelings and so on. So these are the four steps that we will follow. I will roughly follow the chapter here, and I will read some of the passages where it's useful. So Drewermann starts, and for those who follow in the book, this is on page 137, by talking about the roots of war, the reasons for war. And there are a number of reasons, since we're complex beings and have a lot of different aspects. So there are paleoanthropological reasons that have to do with how we actually first became humans. Then there are psychological reasons, and they're connected with psychosocial dynamics. And then he goes into the existential philosophical reasons that have to do with our self-reflective consciousness. And I talked at greater length about what that self-reflective consciousness is like in the first video. on understanding and countering harmful religion. So the paleoanthropological reasons, and I'm only able in this video to briefly summarize this. I recommend that you go into the book and that you look for really the details. I'm giving you the bare bones here, and so there will probably be a number of questions. But the two things that I want to emphasize here are that hunting is one of the paleoanthropological reasons for war, because in hunting, hunting served obviously the survival of people, and by people coming together in hunting, it helped promote social interaction and the ascent of humankind, really. But at the same time, it increased intra-species aggression, which found expression in cannibalism and in the hunting of humans. So Drewermann gives examples there from anthropology. Now, as cannibalism of the enemies became ritualized, it functioned to channel aggressive impulses within the in-group into socially binding rituals. So war, on some level, is cannibalism as ritualized aggression. Now, one of the reasons why cannibalism was going on, and this may all sound very gross, but this is part of our human heritage, our evolutionary human heritage, is that at some point, the enemies were cannibalized because one wanted to basically absorb the powers that one thought they had. Those enemies that one esteemed and that one honored for their strength. And so and again, this is really gross, by eating their flesh and drinking their blood, one could become like them. Now, at the danger of really grossing you out from the beginning here, is Drewermann says that in this early cannibalistic practice, certain psychological patterns were created that were deeply affectively rooted. And that is part of what drives aggression. So when you, for instance, feel aggression, you might clench your teeth. And that's a remnant of that. So it's in our body. Now, Drewermann thinks that this early archaic form of aggression has to be dealt with in some symbolic form in order to prevent war from happening. So this aggression that's part of our evolutionary heritage has to be addressed, this cannibalistic aggression that's in our bodies, in our early part of our brain. And that religion, here's what Drewermann says, that religion actually has tried to do that. And we'll get to that, that religion has formed religious holy meals where it tries to do some of that. But I have to really get to how he thinks of the mechanisms for that, so that it's not about realistically, it's not about externally doing things. It's what religion tries to do is it tries to pull it from the outside to the inside and create symbols that can sublimate the aggression, so it doesn't have any external negative effect, destructive effect, nor internal negative destructive effect. And this is where, unfortunately, Christianity, as we will get into the inadvertent fueling of war, Christianity failed in many respects because it basically turned the aggression inside in terms of horrendous guilt feelings. So that's not a solution to the problem of war. In fact, it actually furthers the aggression eventually. But I'm getting ahead of myself here. So these paleoanthropological reasons are very much connected to biological survival. Then there are specifically psychological reasons for the emergence of war, for waging war. One of them is territoriality. And, you know, if you see two dogs barking at each other, one of them trying to protect their territory, you kind of get an idea of what we're talking about. That is one of the psychological reasons for war. And of course, it's connected also to certain survival mechanisms as well, but it's more of a psychological mechanism. And Drewermann actually says that this is psychologically perhaps the quote most profound and most original motif of war, unquote. So because as humans proliferated in search of ever new territories to secure food and progeny, humans started basically defending territory against outgroups. And so this is also how racism was born. After certain groups had left and then they would be encountered again and they had changed, the territory became defended as this is ours, and I'm really overly simplifying here, and those strangers shouldn't be coming into our territory. This is still undergirding our territorial and highly rationalized boundaries and borders that we have created. Instead of a common humanity, we still basically are dominated by this psychological principle of territoriality. And that is a big reason for waging war. Then there are social psychological group dynamics. And Drewermann highlights three basic laws of group dynamics. I'm not going to go into the details of this, but one of them is that the group defines itself through a common enemy and cements its own cohesiveness in doing so. And that is something that's very often seen in dictatorships, but it's also seen in the United States here. The United States always is looking for another enemy, whether it's internal or external. It might be the Bolsheviks, it might be internally the immigrants, and so on. But what is part of that dynamic is that in the radical struggle for survival psychologically, the factor of fear has been very predominant, and it should not be underestimated as a cause of war, and for the attempt at the eradication of the other. Now, this brings us to the more spiritual side of reasons for war. And when I say spiritual here, I don't mean something really lofty. What I mean here is the eradication of the other, the killing of the other, is an attempt at a spiritual solution. Let me explain this, because often it's thought of as spirituality as something positive. So I'm going back to that spirit is basically self-reflective consciousness. And that, as I explained last time, that you can imagine this like two opposing mirrors. And the neurologist Gerald Edelman, who received the Nobel Prize for his work, thought of it this way, that there are neuronal maps in one place that mirror neuronal maps in another place, and that then re-entrant loops get created. That's basically self-consciousness or self-awareness. And so what Drewermann says is that this self-awareness, just like two opposing mirrors, creates infinite reflections. And so this emergence of self-awareness, of self-consciousness, basically is the origin for infinity, for the possibility to think of infinity. It is even what I want to emphasize here, the condition for the possibility to think of a God, of an infinite being, of an absolute being. That's very much related to the structure of our self-consciousness. Now, what happens as, excuse me, as we became self-aware is we also realized that we can kill somebody and solve the problem of a threat forever. You see, forever is an absolute, infinite kind of solution, or as the infamous term that Hitler used to create a final solution. He wanted to eradicate a whole people. The structure there is of trying to find a final solution and to forever kill off a person or kill off a group. Now, we have to understand that this is coming from the human spirit. It's not just coming from the evolutionary heritage, because animals, Drewermann emphasizes, animals are not necessarily interested in killing another animal. They want to get the animal out of their territory. Once the animal is out of their territory, they usually don't try to finish them off. In fact, it's when wolves are fighting, and one wolf who is clearly losing, the wolf may show its neck, and that is actually an evolutionary sign that the dominant wolf will then stop, and the wolf who lost leaves. So the idea that we can use war to kill the enemy forever is a spiritual dimension. This has to do with our self-reflective consciousness. And this is an example where we, with our spirit, try to find a solution to something, like we try to really, by killing off the enemy, what we're trying actually to do there is to eradicate the fear of, eradicate the danger of death. But of course, we can never do that by physically acting. So we as human beings are, as far as we know, the only species that is aware that it cannot solve certain problems, cannot answer certain questions through biological means. So these are some of the reasons for war. And the spiritual reason, I want to emphasize this because that will be relevant for the limit of ethics, is that when our human self-reflective consciousness infinitizes the fear, it basically uses reason to try to fight that infinitized fear. So all the threats that have become magnified and look like much bigger than they really are, those are then fought with a reason that's getting infected by fear. There is a school of thought, the Frankfurt School of Sociology, that talked about this, and Drewermann has borrowed from them the idea that reason goes mad with fear. So that's something that's really important to let sink in, because we often think that, oh, we can just be rational and fight war. But our self-reflective consciousness can make reason itself go mad with fear. And if reason is infected with fear, then it will use all means, technological means, to fight the danger. And so Drewermann says, here is a quote, this on page 141, nothing exposes the human being as a sick animal more than the hypertrophy of fear and violence, which has gotten out of hand. So he continues, we can formulate the diagnosis of the madness of the human psyche also in terms of the physiology of the brain. The cerebrum, meaning our frontal cortex, reflects and operationalizes the programs of the archaic brainstem, which is unchanged since the Stone Age, in such a way that those programs become utterly crazy. Therefore, the task is thus not to simply abolish the old human, as sometimes is said, but rather to decrease the fear that comes into existence through our human reason, that distorts the original programs of nature, which wouldn't get out of hand like this, into madness and transforms them in the end, transforms humans in the end into ill animals. The actual question that needs to be answered if one wants to get rid of the symptoms of human insanity in the form of war is this: how could the human being use her or his reason in such a way that it does not merely become the fear-increasing henchman of archaic fears, but that it would be transformed into a true organ for calming fear? So this is a big question. How can reason calm enough so that it can also calm the evolutionary fears? Now, Drewermann emphasizes that, very often when people are going to war, let's say soldiers and bombers, they may not feel any fear at all, what we would call affective fear. But that's not all that he means with fear. Fear can be a whole attitude. It can be the petrification of oneself. It is in existential philosophical term, it's a projection of life as a whole. It's like an attitude of life, or in psychological terms, William Reich spoke of character armor or certain personality structure that one can develop that is very set and very, it can come across as very calm, but it's just exuding aggression in its calmness. And it's basically trying to instill fear in others in order to conquer its own fear, spreads death by being deadly. What has to be done is to counter the infinitization of fear of the human spirit. So I'm going to continue here to go into the limits of religion, the limits of ethics in addressing the problem of war. So Drewermann argues that there is a failure of an ethical solution to the problem of war. And we can, for instance, see that by the fact that the more fear increases, the more or better weapons are produced by the reason that is sick with fear. One of the examples is that the atom bomb actually saw the day of light as a, quote, weapon of peace. Einstein, who was a pacifist, agreed to participate in the creation of it if it would end war once and for all. But instead of ending war once and for all, it was very quickly just used to end a particular war. So it was justified, its use was justified by moral argument. So ethically, there have been many times arguments, and also religion has been used for ethical arguments, that one makes moral appeals to stop. And the story of Cain and Abel that I have mentioned before is one where actually God is the one who is portrayed as making moral appeals to Cain to not kill his brother, but to talk it out, and Cain is unable to do so. And Drewermann makes the point that actually the suppression of aggression leads then to a push through and an increase of aggression. So that's the dilemma with an ethical reduction of attempts at fighting war. So as soon as religion begins to justify war ethically, it takes part in the dilemma of the ethical, namely that the best ethical intentions will, in the case of war, lead to the opposite of what was intended. The difficulties which such a displacement of what is religious into what is ethical create are extraordinary and become more complicated the higher the means and forms of war develop. The tendency to justify war is related in Christianity, for instance, to the notion of an externally, rationally understood omnipotent God, who is seen as the author of a certain natural law, in accord with which humans are expected to live. Within that perspective, wars can be justified if humans violate the divine order. And that is how the just war theory was developed. Drewermann deconstructs the just war theory, which is a theory that makes certain requirements for when is a war actually justified. And those primary 5 elements are that it would be declared by a legal state. Drewermann asks, well, all states have come into existence through illegal means originally. The second criterion, that it's fought for a just cause. Well, it's just cause from the winner's perspective usually, but those who are fought don't think it's a just cause. In response to an unjust attack, many wars are fought preemptively and fought for so-called moral reasons, and it's not just usually for an attack, and Christianity has justified those kinds of wars. Fourth, by means which in themselves do not create injustice. This, in an age of nuclear weapons, is simply inconceivable. How these means or cluster bombs and all the civilian casualties, how can they be justified? They are in themselves injustice. And the fifth argument of the just war theory, if the war has a certain prospect for success, success in whose eyes, again? The women and children that are killed wouldn't consider it a success. So Drewermann debunks just war theory, and then he turns to the other extreme, namely, there is just war theory that justifies war, and then there is the other extreme of moralism. Just war theory is a moralistic argument, is an ethical argument, but then there is the other ethical argument, which also argues in a moralistically misunderstood way that pacifism, the moral condemnation of war, would have to be absolutely obeyed, no matter what it would cost. So that no one would really be allowed to defend themselves. Drewermann goes a lot into this and shows how these kinds of arguments will take the Sermon on the Mount and interpret it in an external way, like as a prescription for external action. And Drewermann says that's actually not what the Sermon on the Mount is meant to do. The Sermon on the Mount is meant to change the inner attitude. And we'll get into that in a moment, what that will look like. But when the Sermon on the Mount is used as a prescription for action, it actually can inadvertently egg on the so-called enemy. So let me give you one quote here. He says, as long as the demilitarized status of a country continues to be understood as a power vacuum or as invitation for conquest by the neighboring country, no one who has political responsibility can agree with unconditional pacifism. Hence, ethics is, in the face of a war that it cannot prevent, led into a complete contradiction of itself between conviction and responsibility. Now, Drewermann says this not to justify any war. I want to make this very clear here. What Drewermann is trying to say here is he's basically showing the absurdity of trying to solve the problem of war as such by ethical means, because even pacifism can be instrumentalized for the purposes of war. I continue with a quote here. No single ethical decision exists which would not dialectically contradict itself in the treadmill of war, in the logic of fear, in the escalating interplay of violence and counter-violence. One cannot emphasize enough. War is itself the contradiction of ethics. War is in itself the contradiction of ethics. It is the symptom of a problem whose solution makes ethics necessarily come too late. In fact, Drewermann argues that as long as we wage war, we are not really moving toward our humanity. We get stuck in infinitized fears of our Stone Age heritage. So the dilemma is that ethics comes too late to solve the problem of war. And that is due to because it is the product of reflective reason, of the human spirit. And as such, ethics is itself subject to the fears of the human spirit, just like reason. So, since the analysis, to summarize this part, of the paleoanthropological and psychological roots of war showed that war is rooted both in the deepest layers of and programs of the archaic evolutionary heritage and in absolute fears of the human spirit, Drewermann's thesis is that the problem of war, that is, of organized violence, requires an answer which is, quote, as archaic as war and as spiritual as peace, unquote. Behind this statement is the belief that human peace can only be achieved if the war of the human spirit is calmed and the archaic roots of war can lose their power. Drewermann finds such an answer in the symbols of religion, which alone are capable of responding both to the archaic and the spiritual motives of war. But before we go there, we need to now look at the role that Christianity, both in its explicitly religious garb and in the reactive secular movements it spawned, inadvertently played a part in fueling war. This starts on 152, and the subheading is War and Christianity, or Belligerent Consequences of a Violent God Image. I will start here with a quote that I introduced first. The dilemma of Christianity's attitude toward war is summed up in Drewermann's assessment that, quote, the cruelty and frequency of wars in the Christian West are not a chance event, but have to be considered symptomatic of the inner sickness of Christianity. The inner inclination toward war in Christianity is the more surprising and alarming, since in its words, Christianity has shown and seems to want to show extraordinary support for peace. Christianity has produced a human type that wants subjectively peace, but objectively makes war. In fairness, Drewermann says, one can and should not dispute Western Christianity's subjective will for peace, but its peacefulness is not credible in the face of its effects in history, beginning with the Battle of Constantine at the Milvic Bridge, all the way to the prohibition of conscientious objection to war in the declarations of Pope Pius XII in the 1950s. And I want to add here, Drewermann himself was 16 years old when Pope Pius XII literally in a Christmas message said that no Catholic has a right to object to conscientious objection to military service. And Pius XII did that because he saw in communism a greater danger than in telling people they cannot have a right to their own conscience. This is the origin of Drewermann's own pacifism, actually. Not a dogmatic pacifism, as I will show, but his argument that war itself is the problem and that religion that justifies wars has to be changed so that it cannot forbid people to follow their own conscience. So in the contradiction between a subjective will for peace and an objective sanctification of war in Christianity, Drewermann detects a, quote, neurotic reversal of aim and result in Christian peace efforts, unquote. This counter-finality of between aim and result, which we already encountered in our first chapter as a result of the loss of trust in the goodness of one's existence, which religiously expressed is in the fall from God due to the fear of the human spirit, is Drewermann's primary focus as he analyzes Christianity's belligerent effects. Now, the two main culprits for why Christianity talks peace but makes war are deeply rooted in the origin of Christianity. And when I say the origin of Christianity, I'm not talking about the message of Jesus. What we're talking about when we're talking about Christianity is the organization of Christianity as a group, and then later as a church, and then later as a state religion under Constantine. What makes Drewermann's thesis particularly controversial is that he, as a theologian, dares to locate the inadvertent deadly effects of Christianity's attitude in elements of the biblical heritage itself. So in the Bible itself, the anthropocentrism and the rationalism have their roots. The Bible, this is a quote, looked at precisely as the Word of God, is not only in each of its parts, but also and essentially as a whole, a historically conditioned word of humans. Insofar, it would be theologically absurd, Drewermann argues, if one did not from the start count on the fact that the Bible is shaped precisely by those limitations and one-sided emphases which characterize the area of its formation. So the Bible is also a cultural document, and in that sense is limited. The key contributing factors for Christianity's inadvertent belligerence are summed up in two sections of Drewermann's book on War and Christianity, which later was titled The Spiral of Anxiety. And so let's start with rationalism and anthropocentrism and the roots for that. Drewermann traces the radical anthropocentrism, meaning that humans are in the center of the universe, which, and not just like in terms of meaning, but also naturally in the universe, center of the universe. This notion, Christianity, got developed from influences in Greco-Roman philosophy and worldview, and also from Hebrew Bible influences. The radical anthropocentrism comes from those two sources, while the one-sided rational attitude, where the psyche basically is suppressed except for reason, goes primarily back to Greco-Roman influences. So Drewermann shows in the analysis, and that can be read in my book, how that developed. As Greek mythology was abandoned in Ionian philosophy, Greek philosophy, which tried to replace myth with logos, and in the place of feeling, reason, that implied an estrangement from inner nature and from the myth-creating layers of the human mind. Soon, the rationality of thinking destroyed the entire spiritual basis of the old faith in the gods. Now, hand in hand went the Greek partition of human history from mere external natural history, thus alienating humans from nature. Human reason became the measure of all things. This one-sidedly rational, anthropocentric viewpoint of the Greeks was adopted by the Romans, who combined it with a tremendous will to rule. Now, Christianity, politically and culturally the heir of the Romans, intensified the Roman anthropocentrism, partly because of its roots, Christianity's own roots, in the anthropocentric God image of the Hebrew religion, and partly because of its article of faith, its key article of faith, namely that, quote, God had become human in Christ, unquote. So the Hebrew Bible itself, starting with a focus on the relationship of God to the fathers, started out anthropocentrically as a religion that was focused on humans. Later on, it widened this somewhat to also create a creation mythology, but even creation was thought of primarily in terms of the purpose for humans. Now, Drewermann argues that there's one strand in the Hebrew Bible in particular that is a different strand, namely the so-called writings of the writer that used Yahweh as the name for God. It's called the so-called Yahwist. And we already heard last time in the video that Genesis 2 and Genesis 3 are primarily from this Yahwist. And Genesis 2 portrays humans actually in harmony with nature. So that is also something that's part of the Hebrew Bible, but it isn't the predominant theme. The predominant theme is the relationship of God with his people, with one particular human tribe. Now, Christianity radicalized this anthropocentrism that it inherited from the Greeks and from the Hebrew Bible, by, as I said earlier, by postulating that God had become human in Christ. And so now humans became almost like divine-like, every single human. And this is in secularized form today still active in Western thought, that basically everything needs to be done. Whatever it takes to destroy nature, to destroy animals, if it saves a human life, it is worth it. So that's the secularized version of this putting every human being on a pedestal. Now, Drewermann says this is a very ambivalent heritage we have here. So on some level, Christianity connected Christ with the special status of each human, and it used the anthropocentric worldview to create very devastating effects, both in the treatment of non-human nature and of also fellow humans psychologically. So one of the interesting things is that the German word for slaughter, and one can think of Slaughterhouse 5 by Vonnegut on some level, as a symbol, that slaughter, Schlachten of animals is also the same word as Schlacht, battle, in German. And so battling people in war is also slaughtering people in war. And then if it's turned against the internal enemy in a country, as Vonnegut's book basically portrayed, it leads to a wholesale slaughter of a particular group. Now, the consequences of this anthropocentric and rationalistic bias were far-reaching for the God image. God and religion were seen as radical contrasts to human nature. That is, to the human drives, or human desires, passions, as Christianity used to call them, and to the imagery of the human psyche, the myth-creating layers. Myth was seen as an enemy, and the passions were seen as an enemy. They were demonized. And this was done really early, actually. And I will summarize this here. This is on page 158 and 159, that Christianity, of course, recognized that its own Christian doctrines that were being formed, as the critics of Christianity made very clear, had similarity with myth in the so-called pagan, Greek, and in other philosophy, in other myth of people. And so the early Christians solved that by saying, well, in those other religions, these images are just images, and they were placed into the minds of these people by the devil to confuse them when they hear the true message of Christ as the Son of God, because there were sons of God in Greek religion. There was virgin birth, Hermes as the word of God, Perseus, birth from a virgin, Asclepius resurrecting the dead and healing the sick. All of these motifs were present in the Greek world. And these early Christians argued that in Christianity, this had become history, whereas in these myths of the Greeks, it was just ideas, just images. And so historicity became the criterion for religious truth. And that is why to this day, even someone like Pope Benedict XVI has argued in his, a very smart man has argued that one has to believe that God physically emptied the tomb, meaning physically resurrected the body of Jesus in a miraculous way, and that the tomb was empty. And so he physicalizes it because of this history of Christian doctrine development, that this has to be historically happening in the physical world so that it's different from the myth of the so-called pagans. And one has to believe that in order to be a Christian and to belong to the in-group, basically. So what should be understood symbolically is crudely interpreted in a physicalistic way. And then it is said that if one doesn't believe that God can do this, can suspend natural laws to make this important point, then one wasn't a believer. And of course, Drewermann points out that this kind of argument creates atheism left and right, because if such a God would do this for Jesus, why wouldn't such a God do this for the millions of children that are starving? And why wouldn't a God suspend natural laws in those cases? So those kinds of reflections really lead this historicizing argument ad absurdum. Now, Drewermann is quick to add that there is a real dilemma here, because there's an ambivalence in this whole thing, because what Christianity was able to do by, on some level, suppressing the mythical, it emphasized the individuality of a person. It basically discovered personhood in the way that we think of it today. In fact, the entire first 5 centuries appear intellectual, historically, as a single conceptual struggle to distinguish nature and person in humans and God. So all these main doctrines that were formulated of the Trinity, of Christ being one person with 2 natures and things like that, were developed during this time. There was a preoccupation with personhood. So Drewermann acknowledges the central achievement of Christianity. So he says, quote, "One may reproach Christianity for whatever reason one may want to in terms of hostility toward the drives and the body, suppression of sexuality, and contempt for the world. It is certain that the development of human personhood, the differentiation of individual consciousness from the collective psyche of the unconscious, of what Freud called the id, was possible only due to considerable restrictions and renunciations of drives, of the passions, as Christianity used to call them. The spiritual prerequisite for that consisted, however, precisely in the circumstance that the contents of myth, the wish streams of the collective human psyche, were once and for all connected with the historical fate of an individual person, with Jesus of Nazareth. So I want to make that a little clearer here. So what Christianity was able to do is it connected in its own mythic images the archaic heritage with the person of Jesus, with a concrete historical person in its theology, in its religion. So this connection of the archaic evolutionary heritage with an individual human person is really key here. That's something that is very important to keep in mind here, because that will be important for what we will get to in terms of the sublimation of the drives or the passions or even the archaic aggression through something that builds up persons symbolically rather than destroys persons and other people. So I want to finish this quote because it's really important. It's on page 160, because that was the scandal in cult and rite, not to dive back into the zones of the mass psyche, but to identify oneself as an individual with the individual fate of Christ and to find therein one's own personhood. This experience of finding oneself both in a psychological and in an existential sense through belief in Christ was so powerful that it could not be shaken by the threats of the persecutions. So that's why martyrs were so admired. Now, the discovery, here's the downside of it. The discovery of individual personhood, Drewermann says, quote, contained in Nietzsche, so in its core, all the cultural values that were later created and formed in the Occident. However, so this discovery was, however, bought at a high price because it contained, quote, two extraordinary destructive elements. The first element we already mentioned, by attributing metaphysically a unique position to humans in the world, the early Christian fathers asserted more or less that humans are the center of creation, even in the sense of natural science. So they made humans the center, they created this anthropocentrism. Drewermann argues that this early Christian identification of metaphysical and natural uniqueness of humans inadvertently became one of the central reasons for the emergence of modern atheism. Because eventually, what Christianity had done with Greek myth, saying that this is no longer tenable, natural science eventually did with Christianity and said Christianity is no longer tenable because it has a view of the natural world that is really just mythical. And so that is how atheism to this day argues. Feuerbach was one of the first who did this. So modern science soon showed that nature does not take any special account of humans. The notion of a God who had created the world merely according to the needs and purpose of human reason became increasingly questionable. The anthropocentric worldview of Christianity thus became a key argument for modern atheism, especially in the debates around theodicy, meaning how one could justify God in the face of suffering. So that's the one element, the rationalism. The anthropocentrism and rationalism. The other element, which was part of the process of the discovery of personhood through Christianity, was the contradictory rejection of pagan myth. Drewermann argues this had far-reaching consequences for the way Christianity related to the so-called irrational parts of the human psyche, to the unconscious, namely by demonizing the mythical ideas of the pagan world, precisely because of their evident similarity to the doctrine of Christ. The early apologists, without intending to do so, introduced a deep skepticism against the emotional dispositions of the human soul. Quote, the world of dreams, of longings, of feelings and sensations should henceforth not serve the search and acceptance of divine truth. Rather, they had to be suppressed as something hostile to Christianity because they were competing with it in the form of myth. Only philosophically trained reason and morally practiced will seemed to have prepared for belief in Christ in the pagan world, unquote. Now, this formulation, trained reason and morally practiced will, is very important because that actually shows up in the justification of doctrines to this day. If one looks in the arguments of popes, if one looks in the catechism, if one looks in the doctrines, reason and will get elevated. And the passions, the inner life, the psyche gets pushed down. So, quote, in a certain sense, one can risk the thesis that the destruction of nature through Western technology was only the externalization of the inner devastation of the Western Christian human. This is important. So the Western technology, which uses the one-sidedly rational attitude, is a child of Christianity, a secularized child of Christianity. Because, to continue the quote, because the successful decomposition of pagan myth through Christianity had both effects and called up both in dialectical exchange, it isolated humans from external nature, and at the same time cut them off from their inner nature. And so that's two sides of the same coin. The destruction of outside nature, the simply utilitarian treatment of nature for us humans, and the lack of appreciation for their worth, for external nature as something worthy in itself, is the one side, and then the suppression of inner nature that Freud then tried to counter first in psychoanalysis. So, to sum up here, while the Christian discovery of personhood accomplished, in terms of the history of religion, the all-important step of removing all arbitrary demonic traits from the pagan ideas of God, that was the main point. It tried to remove something demonic out of the ideas of God, which it thought was in those so-called pagan ideas of God. This spiritualization of the God image went unfortunately hand in hand with a denial of the unconscious in humans. So lifting the God image out of the ambivalent imagery of the unconscious led Christianity to the rash conclusion that, quote, in humans, too, consciousness was what is really human, unquote. And this pervades our society to this day. People will say, oh, I need to be more rational. I shouldn't act on my emotions. And we have even developed a whole psychological theory to this effect, cognitive behavioral theory, which tries to get people to think themselves out of it, and which was developed in response to psychoanalysis, which emphasized that the affects are more powerful than the thoughts. The presence of vitally affective images in its own doctrines was seen by Christianity not as an opportunity to ground the Christian faith in the human psyche. Rather, Christianity for centuries tried to do the impossible, to explain by means of reason the irrational imagery that God becomes human through a virgin birth, performs miracles, dies, is resurrected, and ascends to heaven. And to make people accept as a divine mystery through an act of will whatever cannot be understood by reason. This sentence that I just read is a deadly threat to much of theological reflection. If one reads a lot of the traditional theological treatises, thousands, if not millions of books that tried to rationally explain the Christian doctrine, to theologize, intellectually rationalize. What I just read this sentence radically questions the usefulness and the peacefulness of this kind of approach to the message of Jesus. Now, the Enlightenment and modern science dealt serious blows to Christianity by showing, on the one hand, that the irrational imagery of Christianity did indeed not derive from reason, but that they were only, this is what Enlightenment said, truth of the emotion. That's a quote from Feuerbach. On the other hand, that accepting as true by a mere voluntaristic act, whatever could not be explained by reason, would not only be against the principle of natural science, but also unacceptable to the autonomous free human person. Thus, the one-sided emphasis on reason and will in Christianity, sooner or later, was turned against Christianity itself. Now, Christianity was denounced, as it once did with pagan myth, as a mere projection of emotions, not fostering but threatening the very human personhood it officially propagated. The externally and rationally conceived divine will of Christianity could now easily be substituted by other external and rationally conceived categories, such as, for instance, the category of human society in Marxism. So reason was replaced by the group in Marxism. Now, Christianity, when the unconscious was rediscovered by Darwin, by Freud, Christianity objected particularly to the notion that not only the human body, but also the human soul shared a common evolutionary past with other animals. Drewermann considers the secularized remnants of Christian anthropocentrism and rationalism in today's Western culture, particularly the dominant notion of science, which originates in Christianity, the most serious liability to the Christian heritage, as they perpetuate a war against liability of the Christian heritage, as they perpetuate a war against nature. This is on page 163. This is a very important point, that we talk about climate change and the threat that it poses. But really, climate change is a result of the use of Enlightenment reason, unbounded Enlightenment reason, which was unleashed more and more, but it has its origin in the one-sided rationalism of Christianity. The high valuation of reason, and especially technical reason, that dominates our Western technology, and its factually hostile attitude toward nature, that is the real cause for the harm that we're doing to the environment. And that is also the reason for the effect of climate change. So Drewermann argues what we need to do is we need to stop the deadly progress that we have rationalized through secularized versions of ethics, again, from Christianity. A lot here to unpack, but we have to move on. What Christianity's one-sided rationalism led to, in many respects, was in psychology a absurd tabula rasa theory, meaning that we're a blank slate, which is the term used in behaviorism, that we are just trained from outside. And also in Marxism, that we are just motivated by the social conditions, what comes from outside. All of these ideas are actually a result of this one-sided rationalism, which has its origin in Christianity, and then was stripped of the mythic elements of Christianity in its atheist form. And so Modern humanism secularized the Christian anthropocentrism. Secularized the Christian anthropocentric morality and redirected love of God basically to love of humans. The anthropocentrism of the Christian heritage in Western culture turned the most basic processes of nature, such as death and pain, into declared enemies of humans. Instead of helping people learn to live with death and suffering, the quest of medical science to overcome or avoid both is done at the expense of virtually any other part of nature. You hear the anthropocentrism in this. With the exception of Schopenhauer, expressively in opposition to the Judeo-Christian heritage, and Albert Schweitzer, compassion was essentially confined to humans in the Judeo-Christian tradition. Now, the already mentioned reduction of religion to morality in Christianity is effective in secularized form in the modern tendency to elevate morality to the status of religion. The morality of the common good, or a rationality, or a rationally deduced moral law, substitute for God. Continuing the anthropocentric focus, humanistic morality centers around humans and perpetuates and even worsens the war against nature, because in a world without God, the immanent needs of humans become infinitized. Drewermann sums up his analysis of the connection between Christianity's unintended contribution to the war on nature and modern suspicion of the God image. And you can read about this in the book. I will share a little bit of this summary here. So we basically have farmed out suffering to non-human creatures. We do this for food, we do this for medicine. I want to go now into what this repression of the passions or of the drives, or simply of the evolutionary heritage that fuels our desires, if we don't want to use Freudian drive language. Drewermann is not wedded to Freudian drive language. He uses that more as a shorthand for the biological dimension of our desires and our needs and so on. But Drewermann zooms in specifically on what it did to human aggression and to human sexuality, which is tied also in many respects to patriarchy. So it idealized reason and will, and it basically, by becoming hyper rational, it vilified the non-rational part of our human psyche. And by doing so, it became hyper-moralistic. So Freud called that a superego morality, meaning basically we internalized the prohibitions that once came from outside, and we internalized them, and we now basically parrot them on our own. Now, what Freud also said is that the superego, this internalized voice, got endowed with our own aggression and our own sexualized sexuality. Actually, in a sense, it got charged. It becomes love, the superego, and that's why it's being obeyed. And so Drewermann basically, I'm summarizing this here. In a religious attitude dominated by a superego mentality, the guilt feeling stemming from the early oral sadistic conflicts. Early on, there are conflicts around needing food, or there are conflicts around expressing one's will in relation to the parents, the mother and the father. And in shorthand, these are oral sadistic conflicts are not calmed by the experience of unconditional acceptance from an absolute person, but are instead absolutized, thus metaphysicizing the repressed aggression that feeds the superego. So what that means is that the guilt feelings are, again, through our infinitizing self-reflective consciousness, Drewermann would add, they become absolutized and metaphysicized, meaning that they're thought to be from God. And God and the superego get confused. The result is an identification of the God image with the superego. Moral reason becomes infinitized while it is fueled by repressed aggressive impulses from, Freud called it the id, from our evolutionary heritage. While such a superego-based God image rages neurotically against the ego, the I, in moralistically forbidding fashion, it becomes the motor force of religious fanaticism when turned outside. And this is the origin of religious wars. Identified with the superego, God blesses wars against infidels or other enemies in the name of each party's notion of the good. In this context, Drewermann's speeches against the Gulf War in 1991 note that both the American President George Bush and the Iraqi President Saddam Hussein prayed at the beginning of the war to God for victory and for the protection of their soldiers. The identification of God with the superego finds its extreme expression in religious fanaticism. We alluded earlier to Drewermann's observation that in the Christian West, the rationalistic one-sidedness of religion turned eventually against Christianity itself in the Age of Enlightenment, leading to a loss of Christianity of external and political power. Since the days of Enlightenment, Christianity was stripped of the external pillars of propaganda and power and has had to fear for its own existence. But the lack of possibilities to exert external power for the purpose of deflecting its aggressive impulses must once again lead to a damming up of those impulses, and that is accompanied by corresponding neurotic symptom formations: fear, guilt feelings, inferiority feelings, masochistic reaction formations, and so on. Not the pacification, but the neuroticization or the sadistic perversion of human aggression is the result of such religiosity. And as an example, I live in the United States here, I live in Indiana. We can see this currently happening with the co-opting of white evangelical religion in a very aggressive way that in many respects rationalizes racism, even if it claims that it is not racist, by, for instance, using the term critical race theory, basically to hollow out all the progress that was made since the civil rights movements for equal rights. And there too is the underbelly of basically the identification of the repressed with an outside group that's projected onto. Racism does that as well as the control of women. We in the United States witnessed that the Supreme Court struck down Roe v. Wade, which had enshrined basically constitutionally the right of women to choose what they would want to do with their body. And that has been hollowed out. The aggression against women is coming back up. So this damming up of the impulses is leading again to more neurotic forms of religion, and in the United States to theocratic tendencies right now that are using the states, legislatures to make those kinds of neurotic forms of religion law. This is a very dangerous development. Now, I want to go to the other side that Drewermann had also mentioned, namely moral pacifism. He is critical of the idea that one can prescribe moral pacifism. And the reason why he is critical of that is because that can very quickly turn into the same kind of superego formations that we just discussed, right? One can either justify wars in the name of God, or one can justify moral repression in the name of God, which inadvertently always leads to the aggression has to come somewhere else out, whether it's mutilating the souls of people or whether it's coming out in these forms of inhuman laws, for instance, that I just mentioned. So the simplistic, moralistic externalization of the religious message of peace in the Sermon on the Mount must necessarily increase the tension within those who try to follow this view, but find that there are always people without goodwill. And so no appeal to goodwill is then capable to prevent the explosion of violence. And it is precisely those of goodwill and of good faith among the students of theology of this kind who are in danger of no longer comprehending why peace is so difficult to achieve after it has been portrayed as so simple to attain. Ethical optimism is ultimately in itself terrorist, Drewermann says, because it always leads eventually to the breakdown of that, the frustration, and then to the explosion of it. So those are really stark words that Drewermann has for this. Now, Drewermann argues that the commandments, or he puts that in quotation marks, the commandments, they're not commandments, they're supposed to be guidance. But let me read it the way he wrote it. The commandments of the Sermon on the Mount are for Christ, really not instructions for a super morality of human legal behavior. They simply describe what kind of power God can gain in people who entrust themselves to him and who have therefore once and for all overcome fear with its longings for security based on money and power, righteousness and heartless self-assertion. Without the grace of God, it is not possible for humans to be good. So I want to explain that a little bit, what is meant by God here, because the word God for many people automatically implies this pie in the sky dictator. That's not what Drewermann is talking about. Drewermann is trying to help us understand that the belief in God actually, yes, it was developed out of our longing for hold. But Drewermann uses here the image of like flowers turn to the sun in order to soak in the sunlight for their growth. Or when someone is thirsty, that is a proof for the existence of water. And he uses that analogy to say that these longings for the infinite, and that the infinite that is, yes, we can think of it as a result of self-reflective nature, but love itself, our experience of love, makes us feel a longing for a love that never ends. That is the origin of religion, that this life here with its limitations doesn't have the last word, that the abyss that opens up is not the final thing, that we're not just falling, that there really is a whole to our existence, and that it is not just something that we talk ourselves into, and that when we die, there's nothing to it. In order to not, for reason not to go mad, it cannot think itself out of it. We established that earlier. So for reason not to go mad, it on some level needs to believe that its existence is wanted. That is what the Christian faith ultimately is saying. And so Drewermann proposes that theology can best learn from depth psychology, how to interpret its own doctrine of original sin in a more non-moralistic fashion. We did that actually last time a little bit. Theology will not understand the religious doctrine of original sin unless it learns from depth psychology how totally human existence needs to become sick of itself if it is most deeply shaped by the feeling of a lack of grace, of not being justified, of being inferior, of being rejected because one has needs. And Drewermann, in the lecture in the first video, I alluded partly to the experience of infants, of teething, and that was used by Erik Erikson as a symbol for being thrown out of paradise for this story, that ultimately we all have guilt feelings for needing something to survive because there's a relationality. We feel indebted. And that is something that has to be worked through. And these kind of guilt feelings are on different levels of oral level, so-called anal level, edible level, and so on. So now from a religious point of view, one should hence ask, what is at stake spiritually when people wage wars in terms of recognition, dignity, status, and so on? What spiritual fears are at play in the midst of all the economic, sociological, cultural, and psychological fears? The question of war then requires a spiritual, that is Drewermann's language, religious solution that begins prior to any concrete action, prior to any ethical solution, because there's nothing that ethics can do to truly calm the fear of death of a human being. Now, I alluded several times to the fact that Christianity's anthropocentrism, and especially its one-sided rationalism, also went hand in hand with the suppression of women. And there is Germany's most famous feminist theologian, Dorothee Sölle, said of Drewermann that Drewermann's thinking is in many respects very close to feminist theology. He deconstructs patriarchy very well. So I want to summarize here, because we need to come toward an end here, is that the suppression of women, the fearful suppression of female sexuality and of the so-called feminine in the human psyche are for Drewermann the other side of the coin of the anthropocentric, rationalistic, and patriarchal reduction of religion in Christianity. And what he means by feminine here is not women, actually. What he means here is that in human evolution, women were associated with more with being, because the children that women raised in human evolution didn't have anything that they could do for the women. Women had to be there basically by nurturing the infants, and that got internalized in our evolutionary heritage in a archetype of the mother. And men in evolutionary development were associated with hunting and with going out and doing things. And that became part of the father archetype in many respects. Now, Drewermann is very clear that these archetypes are not directly related to women and men. Instead, both women and men have these archetypes, obviously. And so when he talks of the suppression of the feminine here, what he talks about is the attitude of being is being suppressed, and this dualism, this male chauvinistic go get 'em that has roots in the hunting, when that is active in either men or women, then we're talking about a male psychic attitude there. So this has nothing to do with social roles today. Both women and men can be either dominated by either. But what he argues is that religion really, by going to the deepest needs we have, which are ultimately needs for being nurtured, our spirit being nurtured, that is very close to the being mode. And so we need to find calmness in our being. And so that's why Christianity has to stop suppressing women and being so moralistic, and instead become more of a religion of being. Drewermann relies here on Erich Fromm, by the way, and he had received the Erich Fromm Prize in 2007. So in the history of biblical religions, and this is not just Christianity, it's also Judaism and Islam, Drewermann observes a progressive increase of hostility against the emotional, in the sense that I said, feminine aspect of the human psyche, which found expression particularly in the tendency to suppress or rationalize the mythic imagery of religion. And I will read a quote here. After the Old Testament had laid the ground through its battle against Canaanite mythology, its iconoclasm and its increasing legal type of piety in the time after the Babylonian exile, remember, there are other strands in the Hebrew religion. Christianity at first attempted a synthesis of Judaism, Mediterranean, largely mythical thought, and Hellenistic rationality, but the tension within the religious brace were too strong to allow Christianity in the West to retain its unity. Especially Protestantism tried with certain justification to purify Catholic syncretism again from its pagan additions, and to leave behind only the pure, imageless word of God. By with certain justification, Drewermann means by trying to emphasize the personhood, but as we heard earlier, that also had a downside. Islam, on the other hand, as the last of the great biblical religions, already began in the 17th century, where Protestantism started in the 16th century, namely in the demythologization of Christianity. Islam became the only true myth-free, completely rational religion, which knew how to appropriate, especially during the Middle Ages, the ideas of Greek philosophy without problems. The patriarchal God image reduced itself to omnipotence, intellect, and a law-giving will. A God superior to the world, whose adoration with feminine feelings almost had to be embarrassing or at least undignified. This dangerous distortion of religion in the direction of the ethical rational seems to be very strongly connected with the basic patriarchal tendency of biblical religions. So I wanted to read this because it's not just something in Christianity, but it's related to all biblical religions. Now again, Drewermann says we need depth psychology to work through these conflicts that were created, that both are conflicts in relation to the feminine, are both played out on the oral, meaning the nurturing piece that humans have from being breastfed and so on, and also the phallic level, the explicitly sexual level have to be worked through, because the affective aspect of the psyche in many respects has been preserved in art, whether it's in plays or in paintings or in sculptures and so on, in fairy tales, poetry, prose, and so on. Drewermann uses the play by Henrik Ibsen, Peer Gynt, as an example of the problem of the suppression of women. I can here not go through that, but that's something that you can read in my book. I want to just conclude here this section on Christianity's inadvertent anthropocentrism, rationalism, and misogyny that fueled war, with a summary quote. The circle comes, this is on page 185, the circle comes to a close and one sees that all of the one-sided attitudes of biblical religions mentioned so far are in the last instance connected with each other and condition each other. The alienation from external nature corresponds with the alienation from internal nature. The latter is identical with the repression of the unconscious and encompasses the suppression of female sexuality, which in turn is the condition, at least indirectly, for an increase of male aggressiveness and one-sided rationality. That in turn brings forth a social role distribution which prefers the man in such a way that from it spring once more the defense against the deep layers of the human psyche and the progressive destruction too of external nature. The entire arrangement in the relationship of the human being to nature, to himself and to his fellow humans, is based on a form of latent structural violence. The theological doctrine of the rule of a male god over the world corresponds psychologically to the domination of intellect over the drives, reason over feelings, and this manifests itself sociologically in the domination of man over woman. The work of the man shows itself in technology and war, in working on nature and on humans, and both technology and war escalate within this worldview. Ecologically, up to the brink of the final destruction of the environment through humans, and politically, up to the destruction of humans through humans. This is a form of being in the image of God based on the exertion of pure power, which counteracts the actual image of a creator, God. Honestly, it is mere self-reverence, an idolization of money and power. End of quote. So what we see here is a summary of a violent God and image, and how this violent God image is really a narcissistic figment of a patriarchal society, which fuels war and the exploitation of nature. Now, after this, can one really think there could be a religious solution to the problem of war? Well, let's go into that. Drewermann thinks that since ethics cannot really be providing a solution to war, something that can calm the spirit's fear, the spirit's total fear, the spirit's infinite fear, and at the same time address the archaic layers of the psyche without suppressing them. Drewermann suggests that psychotherapy provides the opportunity to observe again and again that there is no straight path from fear to peace. An increase of trust and grace and a slight decrease of fear succeed initially in psychotherapeutic treatment, often at first not to bring about greater peacefulness in a patient, but rather lead, as her ego strength grows, to a setting free of aggressive impulses. Increasing self-confidence stirs the desire to no longer have to continue the pattern of avoiding existing conflicts and issues by giving in or by retreating. Many conflicts that had been repressed due to fear must now be made conscious and worked through. That is, it is precisely in the name of grace, meaning on the part of the therapist, that many repressed aggressions now surface for the first time. Instead of moving directly on to peace, the grace of unprejudiced acceptance provokes, often for the first time, the fears and aggressions which had until then slumbered under the cover of repression. And only through the becoming conscious and acting out, symbolically, meaning being verbalized in the therapeutic encounter, of the jammed affects do the hitherto repressed aggressions become available to conscious steering and free decision. So this is a model for religion, psychotherapy as a model for religion, that originally when there is grace, when there's acceptance shown, then the person becomes stronger, but then also will be directing that aggression against the therapist. And one of the beautiful things that is this aggression is not physically acted toward the therapist, but the person can start expressing anger, for instance, in words. And that way, if the therapist doesn't respond with counter anger, Donald Winnicott basically said that the therapist, the internal object needs to die, meaning the projection that the patient had of the therapist gets destroyed in the process. And that is what helps the patient become more real, actually. Similarly, the peace of Christianity always lies beyond the neuroticisms, this is on page 188, of fear, of the repressions of aggression, and their working through. It is, if at all, a piece of truth. And it always comes only after the destructive work of the cross on the way to insight into self and inner honesty. And now again, cross not as external violence. So from here, the paradox emerges that theology, instead of categorically or a priori condemning war, would have to recognize its tragic inevitability under certain circumstances. Now, this tragic inevitability is not something that is then religiously justified, like in just war theory. This is not what Drewermann is saying here. Which are not external, practical, political, practical, or responsibly ethical reasons, but rather inner reasons of deeper understanding of human fear in its no-exit situations. So this is particularly true for wars that are waged, as described earlier by Drewermann, for a sort of mental self-healing, which actually do not serve the classical goals of wars, such as protecting women and children or the preservation of territorial integrity, but only the demonstration of one's dignity and the preservation of a remnant of a feeling of self-worth. And Drewermann mentions several historical examples where the underdog waged wars like this. So there are wars like that that are tragic when people are trying to assert themselves. Now, but that is not the religious solution. This is acknowledging a tragic reality. But religion tries to actually address these needs of dignity and preservation of self-worth and so on in a non-warlike fashion. So how can religion overcome the reasons that propel humans toward war? We have seen that Drewermann suggests that the key root of war and its tendency toward totalization has to be sought in the human spirit's conscious or unconscious fear of death. This is not so much a fear of physical death as a fear that one's existence is ultimately insignificant and lacks an absolute justification. It's a fear theologically of a loss of relationship with the absolute person who can give foundation to one's existence. In war, it is fear of having the significance of one's existence put explicitly into question, which leads to a desire to see the rival dead. Fear of insignificance leads to a Sartrean world in which the other is a painful reminder of one's finitude, and hence to the desire to kill the other forever. Now, Drewermann highlights why the non-doing of religion is absolutely necessary to solve the problem of war, in contrast to the doing of ethics. And here's a quote: "The issue of war is able, like little else, to point to the absolute necessity of religion. War is that concentration of evil in the face of which literally nothing can be done. But it is really the failure of the ethical position that creates the possibility, even the necessity, to consider the apparent impotence of religion as the only remaining hope. Religion, especially when it refuses to answer the all too impractical questions of ethics, is indeed the only remaining agency which could as such get at the roots of war. It is the only perspective in which the question, who is the human being, or who am I, is more important than the question, what do I have to do? Only for religion does the inner truth of the human being, her importance as an individual, have priority over the correctness of deeds. Only religion is not concerned with the external correction, but with the inner reconciliation of the human being, not with his improvement, but with showing him mercy. Only religion is able to face the human being so unbiased, so understanding, so kind, that it would be able to calm the fear in the depth of the human heart, which again and again provides the reasons for war. Only the non-doing of religion could make peace possible. Religion calms the fear of the human spirit by pointing to a pre-existing grace, to the unconditional acceptance by an absolute goodwill that is at the same time absolutely compassionate. But such grace to calm the deepest pre-verbal and emotional layers of human existence depends on the very images of the human psyche that humans share universally and to a degree even with higher animals. Images which are capable of making us feel grace, love, free, secure, justified, and peaceful. Because Drewermann holds that the problem of Christianity is not that it has not talked about grace, love, peace, justification, security. Christianity in its current form speaks much of love, but it fears love as a feeling. It speaks of freedom, but this passion of the subjective, this most feminine of all attitudes, is fought like a cancerous evil. Unquote. It is the combination of the primacy of grace and of the key importance of psychic images, which are at the heart of Drewermann's creative therapeutic theology that can provide a solution to the problem of war. And so here is how he talks about symbols that can effectively and effectively solve the problem of war once and forever. This is not when a war has broken out already. Then the madness is already there, and they're often only stopgap measures. One should not hold this against Drewermann when he suggests a solution for the problem of war, period. Religion, Drewermann argues, with its archaically rooted images, has essentially the task of helping people experience their unique and absolute value prior to anything they do. So instead of confusing itself with superego morality, religion should strengthen what psychoanalysis calls the ego. One does not, this is a quote now from Drewermann, one does not need war anymore if by means of religion the feeling for one's own value has grown strong enough. Such an ego strength as a function of faith is psychologically the exact opposite to the depressive internalization of war under the compulsion of the ethical. Religiously founded self-respect and self-recognition, inner freedom and firmness are psychologically the most effective instruments for avoiding wars. Religion, however, if it does not lose itself to ethics, consists precisely in enabling and affirming the absolute self-respect of each individual from the perspective of God. And its effectiveness can be seen in terms of how much it is able to mediate credibly in its own rights such a feeling of self-respect and recognition. This leads Drewermann to look for religious images which are capable of calming the fear at the core of the human spirit and to provide a sense of being absolutely wanted. Drewermann proposes that the symbolic ritual of the eating of the Godhead, yes, you hear right, of the eating of the Godhead in a holy meal, for instance, the Holy Eucharist in Christianity, has the symbolic depth and the spiritual profundity necessary to calm the fear that propels the human spirit to fight wars. This symbolic ritual addresses the fears, guilt feelings, and oral needs for hold and security. As one coming from and trying to interpret the Christian tradition, Drewermann is mainly concerned with the question how Christianity can contribute to peace rather than war. He believes that in the symbol of the Holy Eucharist, Christianity has the opportunity to understand itself as a truly universal religion, in the sense that it shares the archetypal image of the eating of the Godhead with holy meals of other religions. But it is important for Drewermann to stress that the symbol of the Eucharist is not meant, as it is often celebrated, to reinforce guilt feelings due to a moral misunderstanding of the death of Christ. Now, Drewermann suggests that there are 3 steps in the way the symbol functions that are necessary for overcoming war. First, in this ritual of the eating of the Godhead, or the Holy Eucharist, or a holy meal, aggression gets ritualized. Oral aggression gets ritualized in a symbolic way. And it's acted out like in a psychodrama, but not in a way that hurts anyone, not in a way that does violence. The second is it prevents guilt feelings because it does not take revenge. It does not judge people for expressing this ritualized aggression. And then in a third step, and this is the most important, it sublimates the instinctual aim of aggression. So it basically moves the aggression away from other people and also from against oneself, and it moves it toward God, toward the one who does not die, even if one aggresses against her or him. So that's basically how he thinks of it. So ritualizing human aggression effectively, it's being playfully acted out, preventing the development of guilt feelings and of fear as responses to the impulses of aggressiveness. So one might argue, Drewermann says, that sports does that too, but unlike religion, sports does not aim at an inner symbolic interpretation of the meaning of life or at a connection of the individual with the order and wisdom of nature. That's just in brief here. So the idea that's effectively behind the Eucharist is that the Son of God sacrifices his flesh in the form of bread and his blood in form of wine in order to be present with his believers and to have them participate in his death and his resurrection, thus connecting the deepest oral, sadistic, and cannibalistic impulses. And so that go back very early. Drewermann stresses that this idea also connects the very contents of the fertility religions that were early on there. The symbol of death and resurrection is connected to that as well. Drewermann highlights that the actual problem of religion is not that one has to kill in order to live. If this were the actual problem, one would ethically have to accuse and declare as guilty existence itself and the natural laws, which ultimately would be to accuse God, and which would lead to ethical efforts to be better than one has been created, or that one is evolutionary finding oneself, and to substitute the order of the world generally with a supposedly higher order. The issue of religion is not that one has to kill life in order to live, but how one can overcome guilt feelings that derive from the experience that one wants to kill what one loves and admires most, namely God, or in the in the symbolic form Christ, right? So oral guilt feeling, however, receives a religious meaning, as we saw above, only if the needs for hold and security experienced in relation to the individual mother figure are seen as expressions of fundamental needs that characterize human existence and are represented psychically in the archetype of the mother. So what may be experienced psychologically in relation to a concrete mother is a symbol for a fundamental experience, not in relation to the mother, but in relation to existence. As fundamental needs, they are needs of the human spirit. What gives a religious quality to the experience of oral guilt, that is of depression, for instance, is the sense that one is guilty merely for existing at all. So that has to be worked through, this guilt for existing at all, because in order to exist, one has to destroy. One has to kill in that sense. So according to Drewermann, the achievement of the sacrament of Holy Eucharist is that it connects with the deepest phylogenetic, meaning species, and ontogenetic feelings, meaning personal, each individual person, guilt, and declares humans to be free of guilt for merely existing and for needing to kill for food in order to live. I want to read something here that summarizes things. The following passage sums up Drewermann's argument how the ritual of the holy meal, of the eating of the Godhead, responds both to deep-seated psychological and existential guilt feelings, which question one's very existence as such. Here's the quote. Particularly on the background of oral guilt feelings, the celebration of the Eucharist in its oral symbolic language wants to acquit human existence from the ground up, coming from the experience of taking in food, and redeem it from the fear that again and again entangles it against its own will into the dilemma of the aggressive movements of the drives, the passions, as Christianity put it. If oral cannibalism represents the deepest experience of guilt, archaically, well, this sacrament seems to say, we allow the cannibalism from God's perspective. Now, symbolically, this is important. We allow the symbolic acting out in form of the bread. If the human being is most deeply confused and shaken by the fact that she has to kill what she loves most, well, we allow her from the perspective of God to kill from what she lives, namely God. It is as if the sacrament of the Eucharist attempts, very much along the lines of St. Paul's logic, to dam up, radicalize, and unite the whole experience of human guilt to its maximum in order to redeem it and take it away as a whole. The Eucharist is thus far deeper and more radical than the sacrament of confession, which deals only with the individual failures of the human will, an absolution of all of existence, deep down into the roots of the unconscious. It is a comprehensive attempt in the manner of a psychodrama to heal by means of acting out what is usually destructive. And again, the last item is very important. It needs to sublimate the aim of aggression. So this acting out, this cannibalizing is not any human, it's not the inner nature. All of this is not being aggressed against. Instead, the aggression is spiritualized toward God. And this has to do also with the longing for immortality, which I will go into in a moment, but I want to finish reading this. It is like an attempt to make and to do consciously what is eternally guilty, eternally prohibited, in order to accept it in doing as not guilty. The Eucharist is like a desperate and extreme effort of religion to tell humans what no mother is able to say in a psychologically convincing way to her child in depression, that the child's feelings are baseless, that contrary to the child's guilt feelings, he is no murderer, and that he can stop feeling like a cannibal and living like a cannibal merely because he has to live and eat. So the model here is that a child might feel guilty for having eaten something from the mom, for getting nutrition from the mom when the mom herself feels depressed. And the child fears the mom feels depressed. The God who one thinks one kills in the sacrament will live. he gives himself. It is the God's own sacrifice, not murder, which happens there. So that is what a God can does, but what no mother can really, or should not have to. Religion could not be in sharper contrast to ethics than by blessing sacramentally what ethics condemns most and by trying to eradicate what ethics particularly demands, namely that humans should feel ashamed and guilty for their greed and their rawness. Religion, not only Christianity, mind you, but religion as such, if one considers its dogmatic teachings, seems to be sustained by the knowledge that one cannot achieve anything in humans if one tries to suppress by means of reason and will feelings of shame and guilt, the beast in humans. It, namely religion, infinitely more courageous and wiser than any ethics, is trusting enough to believe that humans have nothing evil in themselves if their drives and reactional readinesses are not magnified to excessive proportions through the distorting mirror of fear, meaning through the self-reflective consciousness, infinitized fear. So the third item of this working through, though, is sublimating the instinctual aim of aggression. And so here, the ritualized expression of aggression in the form of war, in the form of headhunting, or in the form of cannibalism, did obviously not solve the problem of collective violence. So instead of continue physically acting things out, the aggression has to be transformed and sublimated by religion so that it gets tamed. The ritualization of aggression in these external forms of acting out within a dynamic of pseudo-speciation are actually the basis for holy wars. That is what wars, the attempt of war to solve violence leads always to more violence. So only by adding to the ideas of the integration and of the forgiveness of aggressive impulses, the idea of sublimation and transformation, found particularly in the symbol of the eating of the Godhead, does religion make a third important and in the last instance decisive contribution to the solution of human aggression. Particularly the idea of the external signs of the Holy Meal are spiritualized, makes this sacrament capable of transforming raw human aggression into forces which support the unity of self and the world. So what was archaic very early in human evolution, on some as such, is actually open to a spiritual sublimation in this symbol of the Holy Meal and of other holy meals in religion, but really to symbolically act out the aggression. Very often we don't think of this. We just think of this as, oh, it's nurturing, God is nurturing us. But really, there is also an absolution. We are allowed to express our aggression to the only one who will not die, namely God. Now, in Christianity, this was, as I alluded to earlier, portraying Drewermann's view here, this was connected then with the historical person of Jesus. Now we have to realize something here. This is very important. Christianity made this interpretation in hindsight and also put that into the Bible. Jesus did not speak of the Eucharist in this way. He may have had a Last Supper, but he didn't say those things that are put into his mouth, basically, on the background of Greek thinking, really. The whole thing with wine has Dionysian roots, Drewermann points out. But what's important here now is that this was connected with the historical person of Jesus. And as such, I want to make sure I read this correctly here. So the cycle of the mentality of revenge is broken psychologically by means of an identification with the divine person, which was represented in Jesus in the progression of Christianity, who has made the ultimate sacrifice for oneself. That religion binds the reassurance of life and the forgiveness of one's guilt to a person is crucial to Drewermann's argument. So I'll read this here. In addition, this affirmation of life against the fear of death by means of the image of the dying God is not expressed abstractly as an idea or ideal, but is bound to the person who receives the highest religious interest. The sacrament of the eating of the Godhead even requires and enables that one identifies most deeply with the fear, the suffering, and the death of the divine person. Through this, one's own fear, the feeling of abandonment, of nothingness, of powerlessness disappears too within the connectedness of a deeper love. He whom one loved the most, because he is life, he also died. Only through the overcoming of fear, by means of such an identification with him who overcomes death, does the inner freedom for peace come into existence from the ground up. The ego strength and self-respect and the trust in the value of one's life that cannot be lost in the face of death enable one within to be outwardly generous and to let oneself and others live. War as a battle for existence, the instrumentalization of death within the constant threat of death, loses its justification and its necessity if life shows itself to be confirmed, recognized, and everlasting. The sacrament of the eating of the Godhead is seen in this perspective really as a sacrament of reconciliation, reconciliation with the worst enemy feared, death. So why immortality? Why everlasting? Because by identifying with the dying God, who was in Christianity identified with a historical person, this fusion of historical person with the archaic, working through the archaic imagery, that is what strengthened personhood in Christianity. That is what allowed Christianity to develop a form of spirituality that has the potential to overcome war by working through those guilt feelings that we have for simply existing. So that basically brings us toward the end here. There is more here in the book that you can read. But based on this, Drewermann also calls for, since he says that the attitude of being is needed rather than the attitude of doing as in ethics, he says that this shows also the necessity of the priesthood of women, because women are closer to the attitude of being than men culturally because of the way the societal roles were distributed. Finally, this holy meal, this working through of things can lead to a universal siblingship in which hunger and death are no longer the reasons to fight one another under the spell of fear, but become reasons to come together and to share. So the holy meal, the sacrament of the Eucharist, could become a humanity-wide psychotherapy, not to impose one religion on another, but as a universal symbol, which can be connected to holy meals in other religions. So this brings us to the end here. One final warning is that this cannot be imposed on people. One cannot say, oh, now you all just have to have Holy Eucharist and then we'll be all kumbaya and there will be no war anymore. As Drewermann emphasized, if one tries to make this into an ethical imperative, then it'll backfire. It will not be able to address the guilt feelings, which will go push down again, and aggression will only fester and come out. So recognizing tragedy is important, and one cannot elevate even the ideal of nonviolence as an ethical imperative that is imposed from the outside. It has to grow from the inside, and people have to have time to be able to develop it. So if, though, people get strengthened in their real I, in what psychoanalysis calls the ego, then Drewermann argues, then people will be not susceptible to be pulled down into the collective mass hysteria that was Nazi Germany, or that is really any fascist collective sickness that can inflict a nation and that can lead to horrendous wars, or to racism or to misogyny. So here ends this lecture on how the problem of war can be solved by working through unhealthy religion, by working through violent God images, by means of Drewermann's method of depth psychology, and also of existential reflection on the infinitization that we create of fear and how those fears can be addressed. I thank you for listening. This video turned out to be a little longer, but we will come next time to looking at how the masochism that has been inflicted in the name of the cross can be worked through, the sadomasochism that has been inflicted in the name of Jesus, and that is so prevalent, especially in conservative circles of all stripes, of whether it's Catholicism, whether it's evangelicalism. We'll take a look at how the non-violent heritage of Jesus can be recovered, and how masochist, the sadomasochistic misunderstanding of Jesus can be undone. That's in chapter 3 of this book, A Violent God Image, which analyzes a violent God image using Drewermann's analysis. Thank you very much, and until next week. Bye-bye.